"The sarcophagus is singing again," curator Avental said, and the three junior archivists in the restoration bay stopped what they were doing. Not because the statement itself was alarming. The sarcophagus had been producing intermittent low-frequency tonal emissions for the past 11 days, ever since the salvage hauler Grant Daskary had dragged it out of a debris field in the Cathara Rift and sold it to the Athavari Museum of Deep Antiquities for a price that Even still considered robbery. The emissions had been catalogued, measured, spectrally analyzed, and filed under the designation residual energy discharge consistent with depleted power cell degradation. The museum's chief physicist, Dr. Torin Vasek, had signed off on the assessment personally. Depleted, degrading, harmless. But Even had not said the sarcophagus was emitting. She had said it was singing. And in 41 years of curating alien artifacts from extinct civilizations across the deep frontier, Avental had never once used imprecise language about an object in her care. She stood at the center of the restoration bay, a tall woman with the angular features and deep copper skin of the Athavari, the species that had built this museum 6,000 years ago on the tidally locked world of Athava Prime, in the permanent twilight band between the scorched dayside and the frozen night. The bay was vast, cathedral-ceilinged, lit by diffuse daylight channeled through crystalline light pipes from the surface. Dust motes drifted in the pale blue-white glow. The walls were lined with sealed containment alcoves, each one holding a catalogued artifact from one of the 37 extinct civilizations the museum had documented over its millennia of operation. Most were fragments, shards, broken tools, corroded hull plates, partial inscriptions etched into materials that no living species could identify. The debris of peoples who had risen, built, and vanished so completely that even their names were scholarly inventions. The sarcophagus was different. It lay on the central examination platform, a raised stone slab fitted with scanning arrays and environmental monitors, and it did not look like debris. It looked like it had been finished yesterday. 2 meters long, 1 meter wide, half a meter deep, carved from a single block of stone so black it seemed to drink the light that touched it. The surface was covered in carved glyphs, thousands of them, running in spiraling patterns from the head to the foot, each one cut with a precision that Even's analysis tools described as submolecular, and that her own experienced eye described as impossible. The glyphs were small, dense, layered in a pattern that suggested not decoration, but language, a language that matched nothing in the compact's xenolinguistic databases, nothing in the museum's own archives, nothing in 6,000 years of collected records. And it was singing. The sound was barely audible. A low, sustained tone that sat at the threshold of hearing, the kind of sound you felt in the bones of your face before your ears registered it. It had started 11 days ago as a single note. Then, 3 days ago, a second note had joined it. This morning, a third. The intervals between them were not random. They were harmonic, precise mathematical relationships that Even's acoustic analysis software identified as a chord structure based on ratios that no known musical tradition used but that were, according to the software's somewhat bewildered output, internally consistent and structurally complete. Whatever this chord was built to do, it was building towards something. "Clear the bay," Even said. Her voice was calm. It was always calm. 41 years of handling objects that predated living memory had given her a relationship with the unknown that looked, from the outside, like serenity. From the inside, it felt more like the controlled stillness of a person standing at the edge of a cliff who has decided not to look down. Seal the containment alcoves. Full environmental isolation. I want atmospheric readings every 60 seconds and a direct comm link to Dr. Vasek. The junior archivists moved. They were well trained. Even accepted nothing less. And within 4 minutes the bay was sealed, the alcoves locked, and the environmental monitors cycling through their readings with the quiet efficiency of systems designed to detect catastrophe at the molecular level. Yvonne remained at the platform. She stood at the head of the sarcophagus, close enough to feel the vibration of the cord through the soles of her boots, and she looked down at the carved surface with an expression that her junior staff, had they been present to see it, would not have recognized. It was not the composed, analytical focus she wore when examining a new acquisition. It was not the satisfied precision she showed when completing a restoration. It was something older than either, something that came from a part of her professional instinct that she had learned, over 4 decades, to trust above every instrument in the museum. The glyphs were changing. Not moving, not rearranging. But the light in the bay, the steady, diffuse daylight piped in from the surface, was catching the carved channels differently than it had yesterday, as though the depth of the cuts had shifted overnight, as though the stone itself had grown, imperceptibly, around the carvings, altering the angle at which light entered the grooves and therefore altering the shadows they cast. The effect was subtle. At standard observation distance, the sarcophagus looked exactly as it had when Grant Daskery's crew had hauled it onto the museum's receiving dock 11 days ago. But Yvonne was not at standard observation distance. She was close, and she had spent 41 years learning to see what instruments missed. The spiraling glyph pattern on the lid was tighter than it had been. The gaps between the carved lines had narrowed by perhaps 1/10 of a millimeter, and the pattern had contracted inward, drawing toward a point at the center of the lid where a single glyph sat in isolation, larger than the rest, carved deeper than any other mark on the surface. A glyph she had studied for 11 days without being able to read it, because it did not match any symbol in any database she had access to, and because every time she looked at it, she had the unsettling impression that it was looking back. "Dr. Vasek," she said into the comm link, "I need you in Restoration Bay 7. I'm in the middle of a calibration sequence, curator. Can it wait?" "No." 9,000 years earlier, on the same world, in a structure that had occupied this exact location before the Athavari Museum was built over its foundations, a cataloger whose name has been lost to time made an entry in an archive system that no longer existed. The cataloger was not Athavari. The Athavari had not yet arrived on Athava Prime 9,000 years ago. The cataloger belonged to an older civilization, one that the Athavari had found traces of when they settled the Twilight Band and began excavating the crystalline bedrock for building material. That older civilization had left behind fragmentary records, incompletely preserved in the crystalline geology that the Athavari would later use for the same purpose, and most of those records were corrupted beyond recovery. Most but not all. The cataloger's entry, when the Athavari eventually deciphered it 4,000 years after their arrival, described the recovery of an object from a drift vessel in deep space. The object was a carved stone container, black, dense, covered in glyphs in an unknown language. The cataloger had attempted a partial phonetic transcription of the inscription, and had noted, in the cautious language of a professional who knew they were out of their depth, that the phonetic values do not match any index system but suggest a biological encoding protocol. The record ended there. The cataloger's civilization had vanished. The object they had recovered, if it was the same object, had vanished with them, or had been lost, or had been placed back into drift. For 9,000 years, the entry sat in the deep archive, a single data point in a collection of millions, unflagged, uncited, its significance invisible to every researcher who had ever scrolled past it. Until Yvonne Tao, on day 11 of the sarcophagus's residency in Restoration Bay 7, pulled it up on her terminal and read it. Torin Vasek arrived 12 minutes after her comm call, moving with the unhurried pace of a physicist who believed that urgency was the enemy of accuracy. He was Dreveny short, broad, with the mottled gray-green skin and heavy brow ridges of his species, and he carried his portable analysis kit the way a surgeon carries a scalpel case. with the reverence of a man who trusted his tools more than his instincts. The chord structure has added a third harmonic, Yvain told him as he set up his equipment at the foot of the sarcophagus. The intervals are consistent with the previous two, and the glyph pattern on the lid has contracted since yesterday. Vasek ran his instruments along the sarcophagus's surface without responding. He was thorough. He took 16 separate readings: acoustic, thermal, electromagnetic, gravitational, spectral, density, and fed each one into his analysis module before he spoke. The acoustic emissions are consistent with my previous assessment. Residual energy discharge. The tonal structure is an artifact of the crystalline matrix in the stone. It's a natural resonance pattern, not a deliberate signal. And the glyph contraction. Thermal expansion and contraction. The stone has been adjusting to the ambient temperature of the bay since it was brought in from the debris field. The temperature differential between deep space and this environment is considerable. The temperature in this bay has been stable at 19 degrees for 11 days, Torin. The interior of the stone may still be equilibrating. Dense crystalline materials can take weeks to reach thermal equilibrium throughout their full mass. Yvain looked at him. She had worked with Vasek for 14 years. He was brilliant, methodical, and constitutionally incapable of accepting an explanation that his instruments could not verify. These were qualities she admired in most circumstances. At this moment, they were a wall. The pattern is tighter. The chord has added a harmonic every 3.7 days exactly. The isolated glyph at the center of the lid is casting a shadow that doesn't match its carved depth at any angle consistent with the bay's lighting array. I have checked. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that this object is not inert. Vasek set down his scanner. He looked at the sarcophagus with the careful, guarded attention of a man deciding whether to revise his model or defend it. Then he picked up the scanner again and ran one more reading. A deep penetration density scan, the kind that mapped the internal structure of an object down to the molecular lattice. The display showed what it had shown 11 days ago. Solid stone, uniform density, no internal cavities, no mechanical components, no power sources, no circuitry, no biological material. A carved block of exotic stone, nothing more. Solid, he said, all the way through. Run it again, higher resolution. He did, same result. He shifted the scan angle by 40 degrees and ran it a third time. Same. Curator, my instruments are telling me what they told me on day one. This object is inert. The emissions are residual. The surface changes, if real, are thermal artifacts. I have no evidence of active function. Yvain did not argue. She had learned across 4 decades that arguing with evidence was futile, and that the most important moments in her career had always come when the evidence and her instincts disagreed, and she had chosen to wait for the evidence to catch up. I want continuous monitoring, she said. Every instrument you have running around the clock. If anything changes, any reading, any frequency, any density fluctuation, I want to know immediately. That's a significant allocation of resources for an object. Your own preliminary assessment, classified as a pre-compact funerary container. My preliminary assessment was 11 days old. My assessment has changed. Vasek studied her face. He was not a man who read people well, he read instruments well, and that had always been enough. But whatever he saw in the curator's expression was enough to override his resource objections. He nodded once, set up the continuous monitoring array, programmed it for full-spectrum autonomous logging, and left without further argument. Yvain remained. She stayed in the bay for the rest of the day, working at her desk near the wall, ostensibly reviewing acquisition records from the museum's latest field survey. In reality, she was watching the sarcophagus. She watched the way the diffuse daylight played across its black surface. She watched the faint, rhythmic pulse of the chord vibrating through the examination platform visible, barely, as a shimmer in the thin layer of dust on the stone slab's surface. She watched the shadow cast by the central glyph on the lid, and she measured it against the bay's lighting angles using a hand tool so simple, a graduated shadow stick, the kind that first-year archivists learned to use before they were trusted with electronic instruments, that Vasek would have been embarrassed by it. The shadow was wrong, not by much, not by enough to register on Vasek's instruments, which were calibrated against expected parameters and filtered out deviations below a statistical threshold of significance. But the graduated stick did not have expected parameters. It did not filter. It measured angles. And the angle of the shadow cast by the central glyph did not match any light source in the bay. The glyph was casting a shadow from a light that was not there. Yvonne set the stick down and sat very still for 11 minutes. She counted the seconds on her chrono, a habit she had developed early in her career when confronted with data that required processing time. Then she stood, walked to the bay's main console, and pulled up the museum's deep archive. She had already found the 9,000-year-old entry on her personal terminal 2 hours ago, during the gap between observing the shadow anomaly and calling Vasek. She had not mentioned it to him. She had not mentioned it because the entry was fragmentary, uncorroborated, and from a source civilization that the Athavari themselves had only partially decoded exactly the kind of evidence that a physicist like Vasek would dismiss as archival noise. And because what the entry suggested, if she was reading the phonetic transcription correctly, was something that went beyond the scope of a physicist's assessment and into territory that Yvonne had spent 41 years approaching with caution. She searched the deep archive now for everything connected to the entry, cross-references, related records, anything filed by the same cataloger or by anyone in the same institution during the same period. The archive search function was slow. The records were encoded in a format that predated the Athavari's own data systems, and each query required real-time decryption, but Yvonne was patient. She had always been patient. It was, she sometimes reflected, the quality that defined her more than any other. Not brilliance, not intuition, but the willingness to sit with a question until the answer emerged on its own terms rather than on hers. The search returned 4 additional records. 2 were corrupted beyond use. 1 was a supply requisition for preservation materials, irrelevant. The 4th was a second entry by the same cataloger, Second Witness, the translation software's best rendering of the name glyph, filed 3 days after the first. It read, "The object has begun producing acoustic emissions, a single sustained tone. I have measured the frequency and found it consistent with the resonant frequency of organic calcium phosphate at standard density. I believe the object is calibrated to bone." Calibrated to bone. Yvonne read the entry twice. Then she walked to the sarcophagus, knelt beside the examination platform so that her ear was level with the surface of the lid, and listened. The chord 3 notes now hummed through the stone. She felt it in her jaw, in her cheekbones, in the bridge of her nose, in every bone in her skull. The cataloger, 9,000 years ago, had heard the same thing, had felt the same resonance, had understood with the same unsettled clarity that Yvonne felt now, that this object was not emitting random noise or degrading power cell residue. It was broadcasting on a frequency tuned to the skeleton of a living being. The question was, whose skeleton? She called Grant Daskery that evening. The salvage hauler captain was 2 systems away, running a mineral survey in the Paulith Belt, and he was not pleased to be interrupted. Daskery was Cathari, squat, thick-skinned, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone he made his living hauling, and a voice to match. "You paid for the thing, curator, it's yours. I don't do refunds." "I'm not calling about a refund. I need the exact coordinates, sensor logs, and full visual documentation of the recovery site in the Cathara Rift. That's proprietary salvage data. Captain Daskery, the object you sold me is not a funerary container. It is not inert, and its acoustic emissions are calibrated to a biological frequency that should not exist in a carved stone artifact. I need to know exactly where it came from and what surrounded it. A long pause, not the pause of a man deciding whether to argue, the pause of a man recalculating his liability exposure. The rift is deep debris, Daskery said finally. Old debris. Most of its metallic hull fragments, structural members, the usual junk from ships that went wrong a long time ago. The sarcophagus was sitting in the middle of a cluster of fragments that my scanner tagged as wreckage from a single vessel. Pre-compact construction. My materials analyst ran the hull composition twice and couldn't match it to anything in the current alloy registry. Said it was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Go on. The debris field was compact, tight. Whatever the ship was, it had been torn apart in one event, not degraded over time. The fragments were small, the largest was maybe 3 meters, and they were corroded, pitted, radiation-weathered, eons of exposure. But the sarcophagus, sitting right in the middle of all that corroded junk, was perfect. No scoring, no micrometeorite impacts, no radiation patina. Sitting in a debris field that was hundreds of thousands of years old, and it looked like it had been carved that morning. That didn't concern you. It made me price it higher. An intact artifact in a debris field that old is rare. Rare means money. I ran a standard composition scan, got dense exotic stone, no active energy signatures, no biological material, tagged it as a funerary container based on shape and dimensions, packed it in the cargo hold and brought it to your dock. That's what I do, curator. I find things, I scan them, I sell them. I don't interrogate them. The ship that was destroyed, any identifying features, markings, hull configuration, registry codes. Fragments too small and too corroded. But my nav officer, she's been running deep debris routes for 20 years, said the fragmentation pattern was wrong for natural causes. Too uniform. The hull pieces were all roughly the same size, the same shape, distributed in a roughly spherical pattern around the sarcophagus as the center. She said it looked like something had hit the ship from the inside, like the vessel had been destroyed by its own cargo. Or its cargo was the only thing that survived the destruction. Same result from where I'm standing. The ship's gone. The sarcophagus is yours, anything else. How long ago? My isotopic decay estimates put the debris at somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years old. The margin of error at that range is wide, but the floor is solid. That wreckage has been drifting for at least 200 millennia. 300,000 years. The same figure that appeared in the museum's deep archive entry. The same figure that compact biologists cited as the approximate origin point of the human species on a world called Earth in the Sol system. Yvonne thanked Daskery and ended the call. She sat in the dimming light of the bay as the museum's night cycle reduced the light pipe output, and she assembled what she knew into a framework that her professional training demanded be provisional, and that the part of her that predated professional training insisted was already solid. A ship, an unknown ship, built from an alloy no one could identify, destroyed by something so violent that only one object survived. The wreckage drifting for 300,000 years. Inside the debris field, perfectly preserved, a sarcophagus carved with glyphs in an unknown language, broadcasting on a frequency calibrated to bone, producing a chord that added a new harmonic every 3.7 days with mathematical precision. And somewhere in the museum's deep archive, 9,000 years ago, a cataloger from a vanished civilization had examined the same object, or one identical to it, and had reached the same conclusion that Yvonne was reaching now. The object was not dead technology. It was not a relic. It was not a container for something that had once been alive. It was a door, and it was warming up. At 2300 hours, when the bay was fully dim, the fourth harmonic joined the chord. The sound was still barely audible, still at the edge of perception, still more felt than heard, but the chord was fuller now, richer. The mathematical relationships between the four notes were perfect. Yven's acoustic software plotted them as a structure it described in its clinical vocabulary as convergent, a chord building toward resolution, a question assembling itself, note by note, into something that would eventually demand an answer. Yven pulled up the deep archive again. She searched for the phonetic transcription from the second witness's original entry, the 4 words in the unknown language. She ran the phonetic values against every language family in the compact's databases, living and dead. 842 indexed languages, 11 major family groups, 317 isolates. No match. The language was unconnected to any of them. But the phonetic structure of the 4 words, the rhythm of the syllables, the placement of the consonants, the way the vowel sounds moved from open to closed across the phrase, tugged at something in her that had nothing to do with linguistic training. The sound was not alien. It was familiar, not in the way that a known language is familiar, but in the way that a heartbeat is familiar, or the rhythm of breathing, or the cadence of a lullaby heard once in childhood and never forgotten. The 4 words sounded human. She closed the archive. She walked to the sarcophagus. She placed her palm flat on the lid and waited. The chord stopped. Every instrument in the bay registered the cessation simultaneously. The acoustic monitors flatlined. The thermal sensors showed a sudden 3-degree drop in the stone's surface temperature. The electromagnetic readings, which had been hovering at background levels for 11 days, spiked once a single, sharp pulse that saturated every sensor in Vasek's monitoring array, and then went silent. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that had weight, that pressed against the walls of the bay like something physical. And then, from inside the sarcophagus, from inside an object that every instrument in the museum said was solid stone, all the way through, something knocked. 3 knocks, slow, measured, perfectly spaced, the sound of a fist striking stone from the inside of a box that had no inside. Yven did not remove her hand. She did not step back. She stood at the head of the sarcophagus with her palm on the black stone and felt the vibration of the knocks travel up through her wrist and into the bones of her arm, and she understood with the certainty that came not from instruments or analysis, but from 41 years of listening to the things that dead civilizations had left behind, that this object was not what anyone had classified it as. It was a threshold, and someone was on the other side. She should have called Vasek. She should have called security. She should have sealed the bay, evacuated the wing, and filed a Priority 1 anomaly report with the Compact's Frontier Archaeological Authority, which would have dispatched a containment team within 72 hours and turned Restoration Bay 7 into a restricted zone for the next decade. Instead, she pulled up a chair, sat down beside the sarcophagus, and said, "I can hear you." Silence. The monitors remained flatlined. The stone was cold under her palm. "My name is Yven Tao. I am the senior curator of the Athavari Museum of Deep Antiquities. This object was recovered from a debris field in the Cathara Rift 11 days ago. I don't know who you are. I don't know how long you've been in there, but I can hear you and I am listening." Nothing for 2 minutes. 3. Yven counted her own breaths and kept her hand on the stone and waited with the patience of a woman who had once spent 14 months reassembling a shattered codex from 11,000 fragments, working 6 hours a day, every day, until the last piece locked into place and the dead language carved into its surface could be read for the first time in 8,000 years. Then the glyph at the center of the lid began to glow. Not the faint pulse she had detected in the carved channels during her observations. This was different, warmer. A deep amber gold that spread from the central glyph outward like ink dropped into still water, filling the carved channels of the spiraling pattern one line at a time, turning the black stone surface into a map of golden fire. The light was soft and contained. It did not spill beyond the edges of the carved lines. It filled them precisely, as though the grooves had been cut for exactly this purpose, to hold this specific light, to channel it in this specific pattern, to illuminate this specific message at this specific moment for this specific person. Yvonne watched the golden light trace the spiraling grooves from center to edge, and as the pattern filled, she saw what 11 days of cold observation had not revealed, and what no instrument in the museum had been calibrated to detect. The glyph pattern on the lid was not decoration. It was not text. It was a schematic, a biological diagram abstracted into the spiraling script, encoded in a symbolic system that looked alien but described something so fundamental to organic life that any species with a genome would recognize it. A double helix, DNA, carved into the lid of a sarcophagus that was older than the museum, older than the Athavari civilization, older than any record anyone had ever found. Yvonne ran a pattern match against the compact's genetic databases using her personal terminal. She checked the major index species first: Athavari, Tessarine, Drevani, Kethari, Vethani, and eliminated each one within seconds. She broadened the search to all 41 index species. No match. Then she searched the species that most galactic scholars treated as a statistical footnote in the biological record. A recently spacefaring civilization from a modest star system in the outer trade corridors, whose xenogenomic profile had been indexed only in the last century, and whose evolutionary history was considered too brief and too localized to be of broader significance. Humans. The pattern matched, not approximately, not within a margin of error. The double helix schematic carved into the lid was a precise, complete map of the human genome, not the modern genome as indexed by compact biologists, but something older, a template, a blueprint. The genome as it had been before 300,000 years of independent evolution on a world called Earth, had introduced the mutations and drift that distinguished modern humans from whatever they had been at the beginning, unless they had not begun on Earth at all. The next 2 days passed in a state that Yvonne would later describe, in her meticulous personal records, as controlled escalation. On day 12, the fifth harmonic joined the chord. The sarcophagus had begun responding only to Yvonne. She tested this methodically. She brought Vasek into the bay and asked him to place his hand on the lid and speak. Nothing. She brought her senior archivist, a young Tessarine named Kareth, to touch the stone and speak. Nothing. She played recorded speech from 6 compact species through the acoustic system. Nothing. The chord continued, the glow persisted, but the electromagnetic spikes, the thermal shifts, the subtle changes in the glyph shadows all occurred only in Yvonne's presence. Only when she spoke. Only when she touched the stone. She even recorded her own voice, saying the same words she had spoken on day 11, and played the recording with her hands removed from the sarcophagus. Nothing. The recording produced no response. Only her living presence, hand on stone, voice in real time, triggered the reactions. It was not responding to Athavari biology in general. Kareth's colleague, Dr. Talon, another Athavari, male, younger, different lineage, had touched the stone at Yvonne's request on day 12. No response. The sarcophagus was selective in a way that had nothing to do with species and everything to do with something specific to Yvonne herself, to whatever precise configuration of genome and attention and 41 years of cultivated patience she carried. On day 13, the 6th harmonic joined the chord and the whisper began. Not a voice, not words she could parse, a vibration that carried the shape of language without its content, the way a wind through a narrow canyon carries the shape of a human cry without being one. Her acoustic software, running in real time, identified it as structured speech in an unindexed language. The analysis matched the phonetic values, from the 9,000-year-old archive entry. The same language, the same cadence, the same impossible familiarity. Yvonne placed her hand on the stone and spoke to it. I found an old record in the archive, a partial transcription, 4 words in your language. I cannot read them, but I recognize the sound. I think you knew I would. The whisper stopped. Silence filled the bay. Then the 6th harmonic swelled until the chord was so full, so structurally complete, that Yvonne felt it in her sternum like the tolling of a cathedral bell, and the golden light in the glyph channels blazed bright enough to throw her shadow on the far wall of the bay, 30 meters away. The sarcophagus opened on day 14. Yvonne was alone. She had not slept. She sat in the chair beside the examination platform with her palm on the lid and her eyes on the central glyph, watching the amber gold light pulse with the 6-note chord that had been building for 2 weeks, and she felt the stone shift beneath her hand. Not crack, not shatter. The lid separated from the base along a seam that had been invisible, genuinely invisible, at every resolution, to every instrument the museum possessed, until the glyph light reached the edges of the spiral and completed the circuit. The seam appeared as a line of golden fire tracing the perimeter of the lid, and then the lid rose. Slowly, smoothly. With the mechanical precision of a mechanism that had been designed to open exactly this way, exactly this many times, for exactly this person. The air that came from inside was warm, not the stale atmosphere of a sealed container, warm and moving, as though the interior were connected to a space vastly larger than its external dimensions could hold, and it carried a scent that Yvonne's trained senses identified, after a moment of blank disbelief, as growing things, vegetation, soil, water, the smell of a living landscape coming from inside an object every instrument said was solid stone. She looked inside. The interior of the sarcophagus was not a sarcophagus. It was a threshold, a lens, a point of contact between the museum bay on Athava Prime and somewhere else entirely. Through the opening, Yvonne saw a vast space, sunlit, green, stretching beyond the limits of what the small frame could contain. She saw stone columns rising from cultivated ground, terraced gardens descending a gentle hillside under a sky that was blue in a shade she had never seen on Athava Prime, a particular saturated blue that the museum's color calibration records indexed as Sol Standard Atmospheric Scatter, Earth Blue. She saw structures in the distance, not ruins, not remnants, but intact buildings, elegant and functional, with the proportions of architecture designed for human-sized bodies. And she saw figures, dozens of them, moving through the gardens, tending the terraces, walking the paths between the columns. They were human, they were alive, their clothing was simple. Their movements were practiced, unhurried, the attention of people maintaining something they loved, something they had been maintaining for a very long time. One of them stopped. A woman, human, aged, her hair white, her back straight, looked up from the garden bed she was tending. She looked directly at the opening, directly at Yvonne, with an expression that was not surprise. It was recognition. The old woman set down her tools and walked toward the threshold. Her steps were measured, deliberate, not frailty, but the composure of a person who understood time in a way that Yvonne, for all her experience with ancient objects, had never encountered in a living being. She stopped a meter from the other side and looked through the opening at Yvonne, and Yvonne looked back, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then the old woman smiled, small, tired, warm, the smile of a person delivering news they have carried for a very long time. "You found us," she said. Her language was not any language Yvonne's translation software recognized, but Yvonne understood every word. She understood them the way she had understood the chord, not through analysis, but through a channel older than language, wired into whatever part of her had made the sarcophagus respond. "Who are you?" "We are the ones who were here before the compact, before the index species, before the records began. We built the roads your civilizations walk on, curator, and we planted the seeds that your genomes grew from. Not all of them, but enough. The genetic map on the lid. A key, tuned to the biological signature of our descendants. Any species carrying enough of the original genome to resonate with the harmonic system can open the threshold. Most can't. 300,000 years of independent evolution erases the markers. The drift is too great. But humans can. Humans diverged later, 90,000 years ago, not 300,000. Their markers are still close enough. Yvenne's hand was still on the lid. The golden light pulsed beneath her palm. The chord held 6 harmonics, resolved, complete. "I'm not human," she said. The old woman's smile deepened, not widened. Deepened. The way a smile changes when the person wearing it has waited a very long time for exactly this statement, and the answer is the weight they have been carrying. "No, you are not. You are something older. The Athavari were our first planting, curator. 300,000 years ago, on a world we chose for its permanent twilight band, its stable geology, its capacity to preserve records across deep time. You are not our descendants in the way that humans are. You are our continuation. The same genome, unbroken, maintained. The museum you built, the archive you tend, the instinct that made you listen when the sarcophagus sang and measure its shadow with a stick when your physicist's instruments found nothing, that is not training. It is inheritance." The bay was silent. Golden light filled the glyph channels on the lid. Through the opening, the old woman stood in a garden that existed outside every map the compact had ever drawn. "Why now?" Yvonne said. "The sarcophagus has been drifting for millennia. Why open now?" "Because it was not drifting. It was placed. The ship was destroyed, yes, but the sarcophagus cannot be destroyed. It is a threshold, and thresholds endure. It waited in the debris for 9,000 years until a salvage captain scanned it and read no active energy. It waited in your museum for 11 days until a curator with the right genome and the right patience placed her hand on the lid and said, 'I can hear you.' We did not choose the timing. You did. You chose it when you stayed after your physicist left. When you measured the shadow with a stick, when you listened instead of classifying." Yvonne looked through the threshold at the garden, at the figures, at the blue sky and the intact buildings, and the quiet, maintained order of a civilization that had been running, uninterrupted, for 300,000 years, while the rest of the galaxy catalogued its remains as extinct. "What do you want from me?" "What we have always wanted from our curators, to tend the record, to maintain the archive, to keep the threshold open, and to help us hold the line." "The line?" "Yes." The old woman's voice had not changed, but something in the garden behind her had. Yvonne saw it in the figures nearest the far terraces, 2 workers who paused, straightened, turned their heads toward the crest of the hill where the gardens ended and a tree line began. Their movements were controlled, practiced, the movements of people responding to a signal they had answered before. "And if I refuse?" The old woman held her gaze. Behind her, more workers stopped. They set down tools. They walked toward the upper terraces with measured calm, taking positions along the rows. "The threshold does not close, curator. The harmonic has resolved. The gate is open. It remains open. And we are not the only thing on this side." Yvonne heard it. Beneath the completed chord, beneath the 6 perfect harmonics, there was a 7th sound, not a harmonic. Not part of the chord's mathematical structure. A dissonance. A low, grinding, a rhythmic vibration that sat underneath the music like something scraping the floor of a very deep well. It was the opposite of the chord. It was what the chord had been built to hold back. It was coming from behind the old woman, from the far edge of the garden, from the tree line where the blue sky met the green canopy. Something was moving through the trees. Not fast, slow. With a deliberateness that was not patience but certainty, the movement of something that had never been stopped and knew it never would be. "The garden is a boundary," the old woman said. Her body had shifted subtly, the unconscious adjustment of a person who hears a sound behind them that they have heard before and have learned never to turn toward. "We maintain it. We have maintained it for 300,000 years. The planting, the tending, the cultivation, it is not agriculture. It is containment. The garden holds the line. When the garden is maintained, the boundary holds. When the boundary holds, what is on the other side of the tree line stays on the other side." "What is on the other side?" The old woman looked at Yvonne with an expression that the curator would carry for the rest of her life. It was not fear. It was not resignation. It was the expression of a woman who had spent 300,000 years tending a garden, because the alternative was something that could not be named in any language, living or dead, because naming it was itself a breach in the boundary, and the boundary could not afford breaches. "The reason we planted the garden," she said quietly, "the reason we seeded 37 worlds with fragments of our genome, the reason we built thresholds and hid them in debris fields and waited for curators and scholars and keepers to find them, not because we wanted to be remembered, because we needed help. The garden requires more hands. It has always required more hands, and we are running out of time." In the tree line, the moving shape reached the edge of the canopy. Yvonne could not see it clearly. The threshold's frame was narrow, the angle acute, but she saw the trees bending away from it. Not blown, not pushed, leaning. The way living things lean away from fire before the heat reaches them, as though the wood itself knew what was coming. She saw the ground beneath the nearest trees changing green, fading to gray, soil drying and cracking and paling in a spreading circle that advanced with the shape's unhurried movement. She heard the sound it made, that grinding dissonance, growing not louder in volume but heavier in presence. And she felt it in her stomach, in the primitive part of her nervous system that predated language and analysis and 41 years of professional composure, and responded only to the raw signal of something fundamentally, irreparably wrong. The old woman did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Yvonne. In those eyes, the curator saw what she had spent 4 decades learning to read in the surfaces of ancient things, the record, the truth. The whole weight of a story so old and so heavy that no single telling could hold it. And so it had been encoded in glyphs and chords and genetic maps and spiral patterns and thresholds hidden in debris fields, scattered across the galaxy like seeds thrown ahead of a fire, waiting for the right hands. "The chord is the key," the old woman said. "The genome is the lock. The garden is the wall. And you, curator, you are the latest in a line that stretches back to the first planting, the first tending, the first keeper who understood that some things are not preserved because they are beautiful or because they are old. They are preserved because the alternative is to let the boundary fail. And if the boundary fails, what comes through the tree line does not stop at the garden." The grinding sound grew louder. The trees bent further. The gray circle spread. And in the garden, the workers on the upper terraces moved faster now, still composed, still measured, but pressing seedlings into dark earth with an urgency that Yvonne recognized from her own work. The urgency of a person who knows the margin is narrowing and every second of attention counts. She looked at the garden. She looked at the workers, the old humans, the last gardeners, tending the boundary with hands that had done the same work for longer than any civilization she had ever catalogued. She looked at the old woman, who watched her with patience that was not resignation, but endurance, the patience of someone who had held this line for 300,000 years, and would hold it for 300,000 more if she had to. She looked down at the gray circle spreading beneath the tree line, at the way it crept forward with the patience of something that had never needed to hurry because time was its weapon and its ally, and she understood with a cold, clean clarity that bypassed her training and her reason and spoke directly to the part of her genome that the old woman said had been planted 300 millennia ago, what it would mean if the garden failed. Not destruction, not catastrophe, something worse, an unmaking. The gray was not death. It was the absence of pattern, the dissolution of structure, the entropy that preceded everything that had ever been organized or cultivated or named. It was what the universe looked like before someone decided to plant a garden in it, and it was patient. She looked at her own hand on the lid. The golden light pulsed beneath her palm. The chord sang in her bones. And somewhere in the part of her that was not curator, not Athavari, not a product of 6,000 years of institutional training and 41 years of personal discipline, but something older, something planted, cultivated, carried forward in her genome for 300 millennia, waiting for the right door and the right moment, and the right pair of hands. She felt the answer to a question she had never known she was asking. "Tell me what to do," Yvonne said. The old woman reached through the threshold. Her hand was small, weathered, brown, the hand of a gardener who had worked the same soil for longer than memory. She took Yvonne's hand and held it, and the contact was warm and alive and ancient, and the chord resolved into a seventh harmonic that was not a sound but a word. "A name." "Last daughter of the undying flame," the old woman said. And behind her in the garden, every figure stopped and turned toward the threshold. In their eyes was something Yvonne had seen in the surfaces of every artifact she had ever held, the record of something that had endured, that had survived, that refused to be extinguished. And beyond them, at the tree line, the grinding sound swelled, and the gray circle advanced another meter, and the boundary between the garden and the thing it contained grew thinner by exactly the width of one untended row. Yvonne Tao, senior curator of the Athavari Museum of Deep Antiquities, 41 years of service, 7,000 artifacts catalogued, 11 civilizations documented, stepped through the threshold and into the garden. The sarcophagus closed behind her. The lid settled onto the base with a sound like a held breath finally released. The bay fell silent. The instruments returned to baseline, solid stone, all the way through. On the surface of the lid, the golden light faded from every glyph except one. The central glyph continued to glow, a soft, steady amber, the color of a flame that had been burning for 300,000 years and had no intention of going out. Vasek found the bay empty the next morning. The sarcophagus sat on the examination platform, silent and dark and solid. The instruments showed nothing. The atmospheric readings were normal. The only anomalies were a graduated shadow stick lying on a chair beside the sarcophagus, and the faint, impossible scent of fresh soil and growing things in a sealed bay that contained no plants, no earth, and no open air. He ran every test. He brought in 3 departments worth of specialists. They scanned, measured, debated. The sarcophagus yielded nothing. Solid stone, all the way through. In the museum's deep archive, Yvonne's last entry filed at 22:17 on day 13, hours before the threshold opened, read: "The object is not a container. It is a threshold. Classification revised. Recommendation: do not attempt to open. Do not attempt to move. Maintain environmental stability in Bay 7 indefinitely. The garden requires tending. The boundary must hold." Below the entry, in the field reserved for the curator's personal notes, she had written one line: "I understand now why we build museums." The central glyph on the sarcophagus continued to glow. Amber, steady, warm. The fire that would not go out. The record that refused to end. And in the bay, if you stood close enough, if you placed your hand on the cold black stone and held your breath, and listened with the part of yourself that predated language, predated analysis, predated every instrument and database, and carefully maintained record of the known and the indexed, and the classified, you could hear it. The garden, the chord, the sound of hands in soil, tending the boundary, holding the line. Still burning, still growing, still there. Yvonne pulled the sarcophagus's acquisition file and cross-referenced it against the museum's master catalog of pre-compact artifacts. In 6,000 years of continuous operation, The Athavari Museum of Deep Antiquities had catalogued over 42,000 objects from 37 documented extinct civilizations. The catalog was exhaustive, meticulously maintained across generations of curators, and it represented the single most complete record of pre-compact material culture in the known galaxy. Universities sent scholars to study it. Compact governments referenced it in territorial surveys. 3 separate species had based their origin mythologies in part on objects housed in these bays. Not one of those 42,000 objects matched the sarcophagus. Not the stone, not the carving style, not the glyph language, not the acoustic properties. The sarcophagus sat in the museum's collection the way a live ember sits in a pile of cold ash, related to nothing around it, belonging to nothing in the record, connected to no documented civilization, no known material tradition, no identified carving school. It was, in the most precise archaeological sense of the term, an orphan, an object without provenance, without parallels, without context. Except for the 9,000-year-old archive entry, and except for the human genome carved into its lid. Yvonne opened a new analysis file and began documenting everything she had observed since day one. Not the instrument readings, Vasek was logging those, and they showed nothing. She documented the things that instruments did not measure, the rate of glyph contraction, plotted by hand using the graduated stick, the exact timestamps of each new harmonic, showing the 3.7-day interval, the shadow anomaly, described in precise angular measurements, the phonetic analysis of the chord's frequency ratios cross-referenced against the 9,000-year-old transcription, the DNA match. She worked through the night, building a case the way she had been trained to build cases: evidence first, conclusion last, every link documented, every assumption flagged. By morning, she had 47 pages of analysis, and a conclusion that she wrote in a single sentence at the bottom of the document. This object predates every civilization in the compact's archaeological record and appears to be calibrated to a specific biological lineage that includes both humans and Athavari. She did not file the document. She saved it to her personal archive, encrypted it with her curator's key, and locked it. Then she went back to the bay and sat down beside the sarcophagus and placed her hand on the lid. The stone was warmer than it had been the day before, not by much, perhaps half a degree, barely perceptible through the skin of her palm. But Yvonne had been touching this stone every day for 11 days, and she knew its temperature the way a parent knows the temperature of a child's forehead, through contact so repeated that the baseline was written into her body's memory. The sarcophagus was warming up, not from the ambient temperature of the bay, from within. She checked Vasek's continuous monitoring log. The thermal sensors showed no change. 19 degrees, stable, consistent with the bay's environmental controls. The sensors were reading the surface temperature at their calibration distance, 15 centimeters from the stone. At that distance, the temperature had not changed. But Yvonne's hand was not at 15 centimeters. It was on the surface. And the surface was warmer than the air around it, which meant the heat was coming from inside the stone, radiating outward through a material that Vasek's density scans said was uniform and solid, and contained nothing capable of generating thermal energy. She added the observation to her personal file. She did not call Vasek. She knew what he would say: thermal equilibrium, crystalline normalization. The patient, reasonable explanations of a man whose instruments defined the boundaries of the possible, and who would not cross those boundaries until his instruments told him to. Yvonne's instruments were her hands, her eyes, and 41 years of attention, and they were telling her that the sarcophagus was waking up. On day 12, the museum's governing board requested a status update on the Cathara Rift acquisition. The request came through official channels, a formal memo from Director Pelhen, the museum's administrative head, routed through the acquisitions office and flagged for Yvonne's immediate attention. The board had been briefed on the sarcophagus's acoustic emissions during the initial intake assessment and had approved Even's recommendation for extended study. Now they wanted to know whether the extended study had produced results worth the allocation of a full restoration bay and continuous monitoring equipment. Even composed her response carefully. She reported the glyph contraction, the harmonic progression, and the shadow anomaly. She did not report the DNA match. She did not report the 9,000-year-old archive entry. She did not report the warming of the stone's surface, or the way the sarcophagus responded to her touch and her voice, and no one else's. She was not hiding evidence. She was protecting a process. She had seen, in her decades of work, what happened when an artifact of genuine significance was reported before the curator understood what it was the specialists arrived. The committees formed, the access restrictions multiplied, and the object itself was buried under layers of institutional protocol so thick that the thing it was trying to say was drowned out by the noise of people arguing about how to listen. The sarcophagus was trying to say something. Even was not ready to let anyone else into the conversation until she understood the language. She sent the report. Director Pelhan acknowledged receipt. The board approved another 30-day study period, and Even went back to Bay 7 and closed the door and placed her hand on the stone.